We all know what it feels like to be cast aside when we refuse to bend. We've all felt the sting of being punished for standing up for what's right. Alpha King Thorne found young Omega Lira chained to a tree in the northern forest, left to die by her own pack for defying an arranged mating. Any ruler would have walked away from such pack justice. But Thorne saw something in her spirit that reminded him of a promise he made long ago. He carried her back to his kingdom and declared sanctuary. His court was furious. His enemies began to gather. But this aging king found new purpose in protecting someone who had no one else. Lira carried a dangerous secret that could change everything. Will their bond survive the war that's coming? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The stone walls of Shadowmere Keep had witnessed countless winters, their grey surfaces weathered by decades of mountain storms and political upheavals. King Thorne stood at the tall windows of his private chamber, watching the morning mist roll across the courtyard below. At 58, his broad shoulders still carried the weight of authority well, though silver now threaded through his dark hair and lined his weathered face. The crown felt heavier with each passing year. Behind him, hanging from iron hooks driven deep into the ancient stone, his war banner stirred in the draughts that crept through the castle's corridors. The fabric, once vibrant crimson and gold, had faded to muted burgundy, its edges frayed from countless campaigns. 23 battles, 15 sieges, 3 civil wars. The banner had seen it all, just as Thorne had. Each thread told a story, of victory hard won, and peace harder to maintain. My lord, Captain Aldrich's voice carried the respect earned through years of shared hardship. The grizzled soldier stepped into the chamber, his own face marked by service and loyalty. The healers report that the young woman is conscious. Thorne turned from the window, his grey eyes holding depths that spoke of decisions made in darkness and burdens carried alone. 3 days had passed since he'd found her in the northern forest, chained to that oak tree like some medieval sacrifice. The memory still stirred something fierce in his chest, a protective instinct he'd thought long buried with his own family. How does she fare? Thorne's voice carried the measured tone of a man accustomed to command, yet softened by genuine concern. Better than we expected. Healer Merrin says she's remarkable strong, considering what she endured. The wounds are healing, though slowly. But my lord, Aldrich hesitated, choosing his words carefully. She won't speak of what happened, won't even give her name. Thorne nodded, understanding more than his captain might realize. Some wounds ran deeper than flesh. He'd learned that truth in his own dark hours, when loss had threatened to consume everything he'd built. Have the council members been informed of our guest? Aye. Lord Garrett requests an audience at your convenience. Lord Harrick and Lady Morven are concerned about the implications. Aldrich's diplomatic phrasing couldn't mask the underlying tension. They wished to discuss pack law and our obligations to neighboring territories. The political dance was beginning, just as Thorne had expected. For 34 years, he'd ruled these lands through careful balance between strength and wisdom, between the old ways and necessary change. But something about finding that young woman, chained and abandoned, had awakened memories he'd thought safely locked away. 17 years ago, when raiders had come in the night, he'd failed to protect those who mattered most. His wife Eleanor, gentle and fierce in equal measure. His son Marcus, barely 16 and full of dreams of following his father's path. They died while he was away negotiating a peace treaty that had ultimately crumbled anyway. The promise he'd made at their graves, to never again let the innocent suffer while he had power to prevent it, had shaped every decision since. Tell Lord Garrett I'll see him within the hour. But first, I'd like to speak with our guest myself. Thorne moved toward the chamber door, then paused. Aldrich, what do you make of her? The captain considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. She has the look of someone who's endured much but not been broken by it. There's steel in her eyes, my lord, steel and something else, like she's been keeping secrets that weigh heavy on her soul. Thorne understood that burden as well. Leadership taught a man to carry secrets, to bear knowledge that others couldn't or shouldn't share. Perhaps that was what he'd recognized in her face when he'd first cut through those cruel chains. The healing chambers occupied the eastern wing of the castle, where morning light could stream through tall windows and chase away the shadows that seemed to cling to stone walls. The rooms smelled of herbs and clean linens, a testament to healer Merrin's skill and dedication. She'd served the castle for nearly 2 decades, her gentle hands and sharp mind saving countless lives. Thorne found Merrin tending to supplies in the outer chamber, her grey hair neatly braided and her healing robes spotless, despite a night spent in vigil. She looked up at his approach, offering the slight bow protocol demanded, but her eyes holding the familiarity of old friendship. "She's awake, my lord, but fragile yet. The physical wounds will mend, she's young and strong, but the spirit—" Merrin shook her head sadly. "That may take longer to heal. May I see her?" "Of course, but gently, if you would. She startles easily, and there's a wariness in her that speaks of betrayal by those who should have protected her." Thorne entered the inner chamber quietly, his heavy boots making soft sounds against the stone floor, despite his efforts. The young woman lay propped against pillows, her dark hair clean now and falling in waves around pale shoulders. Her green eyes tracked his movement with the alertness of someone who'd learned to measure every threat, every opportunity for escape. She was beautiful, he realized, though not in the delicate way court ladies cultivated. Hers was a wild beauty, like a forest stream or mountain sunrise, something that couldn't be tamed or contained without losing its essential nature. The healing robe she wore couldn't hide the lean strength in her frame or the way she held herself ready for action despite her injuries. "You're safe here," he said simply, taking a chair beside her bed but maintaining respectful distance. "I am King Thorne of Shadowmere. You're under my protection now." She studied his face for long moments, those green eyes searching for deception or hidden motives. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a roughness from disuse and pain, but underneath lay a quality that reminded him of distant thunder, power held in careful check. Why? The single word held depths of meaning. Why had he helped her? Why offer protection? Why risk whatever consequences her presence might bring? Because leaving you to die would have been wrong. Thorne's answer was equally simple, equally honest. Because sometimes the right choice is also the hardest choice. And because, he paused, considering how much truth to share, because I made a promise once to protect those who have no one else. Something shifted in her expression then, a crack in the careful walls she'd built around herself. "They said I would die there, that the forest would claim me as punishment for defying the old ways." "Whose punishment?" though Thorne asked gently, his hands clenched into fists at the thought of anyone consigning this young woman to such cruel fate. "My pack, the Council of Elders, Alpha Magnus, who would have been—" She stopped herself, pain flickering across her features. Not just physical pain, but the deeper hurt of betrayal and loss. "You don't have to speak of it now," Thorne assured her. "Rest and heal. When you're ready, we'll face whatever comes together." Her eyes widened slightly at that word. Together, as if the concept was foreign to her, as if she'd learned to expect abandonment rather than alliance. "What's your name?" he asked softly. "Lira." The name came hesitantly, as if she wasn't certain she still had the right to claim it. "Lira of the Thornwood Pack, though I suppose I'm no longer of anywhere. You're of Shadowmere now, if you choose to be, for as long as you need sanctuary." The words hung in the air between them, a pledge that would reshape both their destinies, in ways neither could yet imagine. Outside the windows, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, and the wind carried the scent of change. In the depths of the northern forest, where old magic still flowed through ancient roots and secret paths, other forces were stirring. Alpha Magnus paced the great hall of his stronghold, fury radiating from his powerful frame like heat from forge fire. The chains that should have held his prize lay broken and empty. The tree that should have been her tomb stood bare and mocking. In the morning light, someone had interfered with pack justice. Someone would pay, but in the healing chambers of Shadowmere Keep, none of that mattered yet. What mattered was the gradual easing of tension in Lira's shoulders as she allowed herself to believe, perhaps for the first time in months, that she might truly be safe. What mattered was the way King Thorne's presence seemed to push back the shadows that had haunted her dreams. And what mattered most was the strange recognition that passed between them. Two souls who had learned to carry heavy burdens alone, now finding unexpected comfort in shared understanding. The foundation of trust was fragile yet, but it was beginning. In a world where strength too often meant cruelty and power meant oppression, they had found something different in each other. The first steps toward changing everything had been taken. Neither of them realized it yet, but the old ways were already beginning to crumble. The horn's deep bellow echoed across Shadowmere's courtyards just after midday, announcing visitors at the main gate. But this was not the ceremonial fanfare that accompanied friendly delegations or trading envoys. This was the harsh, demanding call that meant Trouble Road with armed escorts and political complications. King Thorne looked up from the documents spread across his study table. Reports from border settlements, harvest assessments, requests for arbitration in minor disputes. The mundane business of keeping a kingdom functioning peacefully, all of it suddenly seemed insignificant as Captain Aldrich burst through the chamber doors without waiting for permission to enter. "My lord, you need to see this." Aldrich's weathered face was grim, his hand resting instinctively on his sword hilt. A delegation from the Thornwood pack, their flying war banners alongside their family standards. Thorne rose immediately, his chair scraping against stone. War banners meant this wasn't a diplomatic visit. It was an ultimatum delivered with the implicit threat of violence. How many? 50 mounted warriors, all armed and armored for battle. Their leader demands immediate audience with your majesty regarding... Aldrich paused, his jaw tightening. Regarding stolen property that must be returned. The words hit Thorne like a physical blow. Stolen property. They meant Lira, of course. In their minds, she was still subject to pack law, still bound by whatever brutal judgment they'd passed upon her. The thought of reducing that fierce, damaged young woman to mere property sent rage coursing through his veins. Show them to the Great Hall. Full formal reception. Let them understand they stand in a royal court now, not some woodland meeting. Circle. Thorne moved toward his armor stand where the ceremonial pieces waited. If they wanted to make this about displays of power, he'd remind them exactly what kind of power they were challenging. Send word to Lord Garrett, Lord Harwick, and Lady Morven. I want full council present for this. And the young woman, my lord. Thorne paused, his hands stilling on the chestplate straps. Every instinct screamed to keep Lira far from this confrontation, to protect her from whatever painful revelations might emerge. But hiding her would only make her seem like guilty contraband. If she was to have any chance at real freedom, she needed to face this moment with her chin high and her rights acknowledged. Tell Healer Merrin to prepare her for court appearance. If she's strong enough, this concerns her most of all. She deserves to hear what's said. 20 minutes later, Thorne entered the great hall wearing the full regalia of his office. The crown of Shadowmere, wrought in gold and set with sapphires that caught the light from tall windows. The ceremonial sword at his side, its ancient blade having tasted the blood of enemies and sealed the fate of kingdoms. The deep blue cloak that marked his royal status, fastened with the silver wolf that was his family's symbol. The Thornwood delegation had arranged themselves in a loose crescent before the throne, their leader standing prominently at the center. Alpha Magnus was everything Thorne had expected and more. Tall, powerfully built, with the kind of presence that commanded attention through sheer physical dominance. His dark hair was shot with silver at the temples, and his eyes held the cold calculation of a man who'd built his authority through strength and intimidation. Behind Magnus stood other figures that Thorne recognized from intelligence reports. As members of the Thornwood Council, Elder Baron, whose gaunt frame and bitter expression spoke of a man who found pleasure in others' suffering. Elder Voss, whose reputation for cruelty in administering pack discipline was legendary even among the harsh mountain communities, and several others whose names and faces marked them as architects of whatever system had condemned Lira to death. Your Majesty. Magnus offered the bare minimum bow that protocol demanded, his voice carrying barely concealed arrogance. We come, seeking the return of pack property unlawfully removed from Thornwood territory. Thorne settled into his throne with deliberate ceremony, letting silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of 3 decades of unchallenged rule. I see no property here, Alpha Magnus. I see subjects of my realm, guests under my protection, and citizens whose rights I am sworn to defend. Rights, Elder. Baron's voice cracked with outrage. She forfeited any rights when she defied pack law and refused her proper duties. The judgment was passed according to ancient tradition. She was condemned for her crimes against our people. What crimes? The question came from the hall's side entrance, where Lira appeared flanked by healer Merrin and 2 of Thorne's personal guards. She wore a simple blue dress that belonged to one of the castle's staff members, her dark hair braided back to reveal the healing bruises on her neck and face. But her posture was straight, her chin raised with quiet dignity, and her green eyes blazed with defiant strength. The sight of her clearly shook several members of the delegation. Magnus's jaw clenched as his gaze fixed on her face, and Elder Voss actually took a step backward as if she were some dangerous beast that might attack without warning. Crimes of defiance, Magnus spoke through gritted teeth. Crimes of refusing your duty to bear strong children for the pack's future. Crimes of rejecting the mate chosen for you by the council's wisdom. The duty to be bred like livestock, Lira shot back, her voice carrying across the great hall with ringing clarity. The wisdom of old men who see women as nothing more than vessels for the next generation. The mate who viewed me as property to be claimed and used as he saw fit. You were honored to be chosen. Elder Baron's face had turned an ugly shade of red. Alpha Magnus offered you status and protection in exchange for fulfilling your natural purpose. Instead, you spread poison among the other young women, encouraged them to question their betters, and disrupted the harmony of our community. Thorne watched this exchange with growing understanding of the forces that had shaped Lira's fate. This wasn't about individual cruelty. It was about an entire system built on the subjugation of the vulnerable, the reduction of people to functions that served the comfort of those in power. Harmony built on suffering is no harmony at all, Thorne interjected, his voice cutting through the rising tension. It's oppression, dressed in the language of tradition. Magnus turned his attention back to the throne, his eyes narrowing. Pretty words, Your Majesty, but you meddle in affairs that don't concern your kingdom. Pack law is older than your crown, more sacred than your authority. We demand the return of our property and compensation for your interference. She is not your property. Thorne rose from his throne, his hand moving instinctively to his sword hilt. She is a free woman under the protection of this crown. Your pack law ends at my borders. Then you choose war over wisdom. Magnus's voice carried the ring of finality. From within his cloak he produced a scroll bound with crimson cord and sealed with wax the color of dried blood. This is formal. Notice, delivered according to ancient protocol. You have 3 days to return what was taken. If you refuse, he let the scroll fall to the stone floor between them, where it landed with a sound that seemed far too loud for such a small object. The blood-red seal seemed to pulse in the torchlight like a beating heart. If you refuse, Magnus continued, the Thornwood Pack and our allies will come to claim what is ours by right. We will not be denied justice by royal arrogance or foreign interference. Thorne looked down at the scroll, understanding its significance, even without examining its contents. This was a formal declaration under the old laws that governed Pack. Disputes, laws that predated kingdoms and recognized no authority higher than strength and ancient precedent. By accepting sanctuary duty for Lira, he'd placed his entire realm in opposition to a system that viewed his compassion as weakness. To be exploited, then let me be perfectly clear in my response, Thorne said, his voice carrying to every corner of the great hall. Lira of Thornwood is now Lira of Shadowmere, under royal protection and subject only to the laws of this kingdom. I will not surrender her to face barbaric punishment for the crime of valuing her own humanity. Magnus smiled, but there was no warmth in it, only the predatory satisfaction of a hunter who'd successfully driven his prey into a trap. So be it, King Thorne. You've chosen your path. In 3 days, you'll learn the cost of defying Pack justice. The Thornwood delegation turned and marched from the hall with military precision, their boot heels ringing against stone in ominous rhythm. But Magnus paused at the threshold, looking back over his shoulder with eyes that promised violence. She was mine by right of betrothal, sworn before the moon, and witnessed by the Pack elders. No crown can change that bond, no royal decree can break what was forged in blood and ancient promise. I will have her back, one way or another. Then they were gone, leaving behind only the crimson scroll and the weight of impending war. Thorne stood motionless for long moments, feeling the burden of his decision settle across his shoulders like a mantle of stone. Behind him, he could hear the worried murmurs of his council members and the sharp intake of breath from Lira. 3 days. In 3 days, everything he'd built over decades of careful leadership would be tested against the fury of those who viewed mercy as weakness and justice as whatever served their immediate interests. But as he turned to look at Lira, still standing straight despite the trauma of facing her tormentors, still defiant despite the overwhelming odds against them, Thorne felt no regret for the choice he'd made. Some things were worth fighting for, even if the fight seemed impossible to win. The ancient council ring stood in the heart of Shadowmere, a circular chamber carved from living rock where generations of rulers had gathered their advisors to make decisions that shaped the fate of kingdoms. 13 stone seats arranged in a perfect circle, each one worn smooth by centuries of use, each one representing a voice in the deliberations that guided royal policy. Tonight, those seats were filled with tension as thick as morning fog. Lord Garrett occupied the chair to Thorne's immediate right, his silver hair immaculate despite the late hour and his blue eyes sharp with concern. As the king's chief advisor for over a decade, his counsel had proven invaluable through countless crises. But even his diplomatic skills seemed strained by the magnitude of their current predicament. "The precedent troubles me greatly, Your Majesty," Garrett said, his cultured voice carrying across the stone chamber. "If we defy Pack law in this instance, what prevents other neighboring territories from viewing it as weakness? What stops them from challenging our authority in their own disputes?" Lady Morven, the kingdom's treasurer, and one of the few women to hold high court position, leaned forward in her seat. Her graying hair was pulled back severely, and her brown eyes held the sharp intelligence that had made her indispensable to 3 generations of rulers. The financial implications alone should give us pause. War with the Thornwood Pack means war with their allies. Our treasury can support a defensive action, but if this conflict spreads, it will spread. Lord Harwick's gravelly voice cut through her words. The kingdom's military advisor bore scars from a dozen campaigns, and his assessment carried the weight of hard-won experience. Magnus has been building alliances for years, preparing for exactly this kind of opportunity. He sees this as his chance to demonstrate that royal authority means nothing against Pack solidarity. Thorne listened to each argument with the patience that had served him well through 3 decades of rule. These were good people, loyal advisors who had the kingdom's best interests at heart. Their concerns were valid, their fears well-founded. But none of them had seen what he'd seen in that forest clearing. The casual cruelty of chains and abandonment, the systematic reduction of human dignity to political convenience. "Captain Aldrich," Thorne said, turning to where his most trusted military leader sat with characteristic alertness, "what are our defensive capabilities?" The weathered soldier straightened in his stone seat. "We have 800 trained warriors. At full readiness, my lord. Another 300 militia who could be mobilized within a day. The castle's fortifications are strong. We could withstand a siege for months if properly supplied. And offensively? Against Magnus alone, we could hold our own, perhaps even emerge victorious if we chose our battles well. But intelligence suggests he's been in contact with at least 4 other pack leaders. If they unite against us..." Aldrich shook his head grimly. "We'd be facing odds of 3 to 1, possibly worse." The mathematics of warfare were unforgiving. Thorne had learned that lesson in blood and loss over the years, watching good soldiers die for causes both noble and questionable. But sometimes the right choice and the practical choice diverged so completely that a man had to decide what kind of leader, what kind of person he truly wanted to be. "There is another consideration," came a new voice from the chamber's entrance. All eyes turned to see Gila Merrin approaching with her customary quiet dignity. Protocol dictated that she shouldn't interrupt a council session, but Thorne gestured for her to continue. Her wisdom had proven invaluable too many times to ignore. "The young woman, Lira, she's stronger than her injuries suggested. This afternoon, while helping her change bandages, I noticed something unusual." Merrin paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "She moves with training, combat training, and when startled, her reflexes are those of someone who's learned to fight." This information shifted the dynamic in the chamber noticeably. A victim was one thing, tragic but passive, requiring protection but offering little in return. A potential ally with martial skills was something entirely different. "You think she could be useful in our defense?" Lord Harwick asked with professional interest. "I think she's already more than she appears to be," Merrin replied. "There are calluses on her hands that speak of weapons practice, scars that suggest she's faced blade work before. Whatever the Thornwood pack was trying to break in her, it wasn't helplessness." Thorne absorbed this information thoughtfully. He'd sensed steel beneath Lyra's surface during their conversations, but if Merrin was right, that steel had been forged by experience he hadn't yet understood. "Bring her here," he decided. "If this war is being fought over her fate, she deserves a voice in planning our response." Lord Garrett's eyebrows rose sharply. "My lord, with respect, including her in strategic discussions might not be wise. We know little of her true loyalties, and she could be what, Garrett? A spy for the people who chained her to a tree and left her to die?" Thorne's voice carried an edge that made several council members shift uncomfortably. "I think her loyalties are quite clear." 20 minutes later, Lira entered the council ring with visible uncertainty. She'd clearly never seen such a formal gathering, and her green eyes moved from face to face, as if trying to assess who might be friend or potential threat. She wore the same simple blue dress from the confrontation with Magnus. But now Thorne noticed what Merrin had observed. The way she carried herself, the alertness in her posture, the quick assessment of exits and potential defensive positions. "Please, sit!" Thorne gestured to an empty chair directly across from his own position. "We need to understand what we're facing, and you know Magnus better than any of us." Lira settled into the ancient stone seat with careful grace, her hands folded in her lap but her shoulders straight. "What do you want to know?" "Everything," Thorne said simply. "His strengths, his weaknesses, his likely strategies, the nature of his alliances, and the extent of his influence." She was quiet for several heartbeats, her gaze moving around the circle of faces before settling back on Thorne's. "Magnus isn't just an alpha seeking to reclaim lost property. He's building something larger, a confederation of packs united under his leadership. My defiance threatened that vision because it showed other women that resistance was possible. How so? Lady Morven asked with sharp interest. The arranged mating wasn't just about producing children. It was about demonstrating his power to claim whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted it. When I refused him publicly, it encouraged others to question their own situations. 3 other young women spoke out against their arranged matches. 2 families withdrew their daughters from betrothal negotiations rather than force unwilling participation. Lord Harwick leaned forward, his tactical mind engaging with the political implications. So this is about more than recovering you specifically. It's about reasserting his authority over those who might consider rebellion. Exactly. If he allows my escape to stand unpunished, his entire power structure begins to crumble. That's why he'll bring everything he can muster, not just to reclaim me, but to make an example that terrifies anyone else who might consider defiance. The brutal logic was clear, and it painted their situation in even starker terms than the council had initially realized. This wasn't a simple territorial dispute, or even a matter of wounded pride. It was an ideological war between 2 completely different visions of how society should function. What can you tell us about his military capabilities? Captain Aldrich asked with professional interest. Lyra's expression darkened as she accessed painful memories. The Thornwood Pack maintains about 200 trained warriors, all fanatically loyal to Magnus personally. But his real strength lies in the alliance network he's built over the past 5 years. The Ironbark Pack will almost certainly answer his call. Their alpha owes Magnus significant debt from a territorial dispute Magnus helped resolve in his favor. She continued methodically, painting a picture of interconnected loyalties and mutual obligations that could potentially field over 1,000 warriors against Shadowmere's defenses. But as she spoke, Thorne noticed something else in her manner, the way she assessed each piece of information, the strategic thinking behind her observations. "You've given this considerable thought," he observed. A flush of color touched her. Pale cheeks. "I've had 3 days to think about little else. You risked everything to save me. I needed to understand exactly what that meant for your kingdom." "And what conclusion did you reach?" Lira met his gaze directly, her green eyes steady, despite the weight of what she was about to say. "That Magnus will use this conflict to unite the mountain packs under his authority, using my punishment as the rallying cry. That even if you defeat his initial assault, he'll return with greater numbers and deeper commitment. And that," she paused, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "that I should return to him voluntarily, to spare your people the consequences of my choices." The chamber erupted in surprised murmurs, but Thorne raised a hand for silence. He studied Lyra's face, seeing the pain behind her pragmatic assessment and the courage it had taken to offer such a sacrifice. "That," he said firmly, "is not an acceptable solution. But it's the practical solution," she pressed. "One life against hundreds, my freedom against your kingdom's security. Some prices are too high to pay, regardless of the practical benefits." Thorne's voice carried absolute conviction. "We'll find another way." Captain Aldrich cleared his throat diplomatically. "Perhaps we should focus on immediate defensive preparations. If Magnus gives us 3 days, we need to use every hour effectively." The remainder of the council session was devoted to tactical planning, positioning of forces, strengthening of fortifications, preparation of supply lines. But throughout the strategic discussions, Thorne found his attention returning again and again to Lyra's quiet presence across the circle. She listened intently to every detail, asked insightful questions about defensive capabilities, and offered observations about Magnus's likely approach that proved her understanding of warfare was far more sophisticated than anyone had expected. When the formal session ended and the other council members departed, Thorne found himself alone with Lyra in the ancient chamber. The torchlight cast dancing shadows on the stone walls, and the weight of history seemed to press down upon them both. "You didn't have to stay," he said gently. "I needed to ask you something." Lyra's voice was steady, but he could see the tension in her shoulders. "Why are you doing this? Really? Not the pretty words about protecting the innocent. The real reason." Thorne was quiet for long moments, considering how much truth he was willing to share. 17 years ago, I failed to protect my family. I was away from the kingdom, negotiating a peace treaty that was supposed to prevent exactly the kind of violence that eventually took their lives. While I was making deals and compromises, raiders struck our lands. My wife and son died because I chose political solutions over immediate action. Lyra's eyes widened with understanding and shared pain. I swore at their graves that I would never again let innocent people suffer while I had the power to prevent it. That's why I can't send you back to Magnus, no matter what practical benefits it might offer. Some failures can't be repeated. She nodded slowly, absorbing the depth of commitment behind his decision. "Then we'd better make sure we win." The shadow dagger gleamed wickedly in the torchlight, its blade coated with a substance that made Healer Merrin's face go pale with recognition. She held the weapon carefully with cloth-wrapped hands, examining the intricate engravings along its steel surface, while Captain Aldrich paced the chamber like a caged wolf. "Death's bane, root, extract," Merrin pronounced grimly, setting the blade on her examination table with extreme caution, mixed with nightshade essence and something else I can't identify. A scratch from this would have killed her within minutes. Thorne stood motionless beside the window, his grey eyes fixed on the courtyard below, where servants hurried about their morning duties, blissfully unaware of how close their kingdom had come to losing its newest member. The assassination attempt had failed, but only barely, and only because Lira possessed reflexes and instincts that had saved her life when surprise should have guaranteed death. "Tell me again exactly what happened," he said without turning from the window. Captain Aldrich's weathered face was tight with self-recrimination. She was in the training yard, working through basic sword forms with Master Willem. Good progress for someone supposedly untrained, though we all noticed she seemed to know movements she shouldn't have learned yet. "Because she wasn't untrained," Thorne observed quietly. "We should have realized that sooner." The attacker came from the stable block, moving through shadows with professional skill, dressed as a castle servant, complete with proper clothing and work tools. If not for Lyra's warning shout, he would have reached his target undetected. Thorne finally turned from the window, his expression grave. The attack had revealed several disturbing truths about their situation. First, that Magnus had agents already positioned within the castle, people who could move freely through secured areas and strike without warning. Second, that those agents possessed high-quality equipment and training that spoke of significant investment and planning. Third, and most troubling, that Lira herself was far more capable than she'd initially appeared. "What exactly did she do?" Thorne asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. "Disarmed him in 3 moves, my lord. Professional techniques, executed with precision and confidence. Then she held him at sword point while calling for the guards." Aldrich shook his head in amazement. "Master Willem said he'd never seen anyone move that quickly or efficiently. It was like watching a different person entirely." The implications were staggering. Lira hadn't just been trained in basic self-defense. She'd received the kind of intensive combat instruction reserved for elite warriors, which meant everything about her background was more complex than any of them had realized. "Where is she now?" Thorne asked. "Secured in her chambers, with double guards posted. She wanted to continue training, said she felt safer with a weapon in hand than hiding behind walls, but we thought it best to ensure her protection while we interrogated the assassin." "And what did he tell you?" Aldrich's expression darkened. "Nothing. Took poison before we could extract any useful information. A glass capsule hidden in a false tooth. He bit down on it the moment he realized capture was inevitable. Professional assassins with poisoned teeth. The level of organization and resources behind this attack was becoming clearer, and it painted a picture that made Thorne's blood run cold. Magnus wasn't just an angry alpha seeking to reclaim escaped property. He was running a sophisticated operation with agents, equipment, and methods that rivaled the intelligence networks of established kingdoms. "My lord," Healer Merrin said quietly, "there's something else you should know about the young woman's injuries." Thorne turned his attention to the elderly healer, noting the troubled expression on her kind face. "What is it?" "When I examined her after the attack, I found old scars I hadn't noticed before. Training scars, but also punishment marks. Someone taught her to fight, but they also hurt her badly when she failed to meet their standards." The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to form a disturbing picture. Lira hadn't just received combat training. She'd been subjected to brutal conditioning that had forged her into a weapon. But whose weapon? And why had someone with such valuable skills been cast out by the Thornwood pack? "I need to speak with her," Thorne decided. "Alone!" Captain Aldrich started to protest, but Thorne cut him off with a raised hand. "The assassin is dead, and we have double guards posted. I need answers, and she's not going to provide them with an audience of suspicious faces staring at her." Lyra's chambers occupied a corner of the castle's residential wing, chosen for their defensibility and the excellent sightlines they provided to approaching threats. Two of Thorne's most trusted guards flanked the door, their hands resting on sword hilts as they acknowledged their king's approach with respectful nods. "Has she asked for anything?" Thorne inquired. "Water and weapons, my lord," one guard replied with a slight smile. "In that order." "We provided the water." Thorne knocked gently on the chamber door before entering, not wanting to surprise someone whose reflexes had proven lethal to those who threatened her. "Lira? It's King Thorne. May I come in?" "Please," came her voice from within, though he could hear the tension underlying the simple word. She sat beside the window, gazing out at the afternoon sky with the stillness of someone lost in deep thought. The simple blue dress had been replaced with practical clothing borrowed from the castle's staff, dark leggings and a tunic that wouldn't restrict movement if she needed to fight again. Her dark hair was braided back in a warrior's knot, and her green eyes held a wariness that hadn't been there during their previous conversations. "You lied to me," Thorne said without preamble, taking a chair across from her but maintaining respectful distance. "I omitted certain truths," Lira corrected. "Carefully. There's a difference." "Is there, when those omissions put my people at risk?" She flinched as if he'd struck her, and for a moment the mask of control slipped to reveal the pain beneath. "You're right. I should have told you about my training, about what Magnus really intended when he arranged our betrothal, about why the council was so eager to see me punished. Then tell me now." Lira was quiet for several heartbeats, her fingers absently tracing old scars on her forearms that Thorne could now see were the precise marks left by blade work and combat training. When she spoke, her voice carried the flat tone of someone recounting a nightmare that had become commonplace. "Magnus didn't want me just as a mate. He wanted me as his personal enforcer. For the past 3 years, he's been training selected women from allied packs in combat techniques, espionage, and assassination. His vision of pack unity required agents who could move through enemy territories undetected, who, better than women, dismissed as harmless by traditional societies. The scope of Magnus's ambitions was becoming clearer, and it was far more sophisticated and dangerous than anyone had imagined. He wasn't just building a confederation of packs. He was creating an intelligence network capable of infiltrating and destabilizing neighboring kingdoms. "You were part of this program." "I was his first success," Lira admitted, shame coloring her voice. "Recruited at 15 when my parents died in a hunting accident. Told it was an honor to serve the packs. Greater purpose. Trained in weapons, poisons, infiltration techniques, seduction, anything that might prove useful for gathering information or eliminating threats. How many others?" "At least a dozen that I knew of, probably more in the allied packs. Magnus called us his silent wolves. weapons hidden in plain sight, ready to strike when commanded. Thorne absorbed this information with growing unease. If Magnus had been building such a network for years, then the threat extended far beyond simple military conflict. There could be agents already positioned throughout the region, gathering intelligence and preparing for coordinated strikes against multiple targets. What changed? He asked. Why did you refuse his commands? Litra's hands clenched into fists, and her green eyes blazed with remembered fury. He ordered me to eliminate a young woman in the Riverside pack who'd been speaking out against arranged matings. Said she was spreading dangerous ideas that threatened pack stability. I was supposed to make it look like an accident. Poison. In her food. A fall from a cliff. Anything that wouldn't point back to Magnus. But you didn't do it. I couldn't. Her voice broke slightly, revealing the emotional cost of that decision. She reminded me of myself at that age, full of hope and dreams, believing she could change things for the better. How could I kill someone whose only crime was wanting the same freedom I'd begun to desire for myself? The assassination order had been a test, Thorne realized. Magnus had been evaluating whether his prized weapon would follow commands even when they conflicted with her emerging conscience. When Lira failed that test, she'd become a liability rather than an asset. So he arranged your betrothal as punishment and as demonstration. If his own trained assassin could be broken to his will through forced mating and breeding, it would send a clear message to every other woman in his network about the consequences of defiance. The casual cruelty of it was breathtaking. Magnus hadn't just been asserting dominance over a rebellious subordinate. He'd been making a political statement about the ultimate fate of anyone who dared to question his authority. The chains, the tree, that was theater as much as punishment, Thorne observed. Exactly. Public humiliation designed to destroy any remaining sympathy for my cause and demonstrate the futility of resistance. If not for your intervention, I would have died as an object lesson in the price of defying pack law. Thorne rose from his chair and moved to the window, gazing out at his kingdom's peaceful afternoon routine, while processing the full scope of the threat they faced. Magnus wasn't just seeking to reclaim escaped property. He was protecting a years-long investment in building a clandestine network that could threaten the stability of every neighboring territory. There's more, Lira said quietly behind him. The assassination attempt this morning, that wasn't random. Magnus has people inside your castle, and they've been reporting on your defenses, your capabilities, your weaknesses. How do you know? Because I recognized the blade work. The assassin moved like someone trained in my former pack's techniques, and the poison on that dagger. That's a Magnus specialty. He taught us to prepare it ourselves as part of our conditioning, which meant their defensive preparations had been compromised from the beginning. Magnus knew exactly what forces they could muster, what strategies they might employ, what resources they could bring to bear. The 3-day ultimatum wasn't just political theater, it was cover for intelligence gathering and final preparations. How many agents do you think he has here? Thorne asked. At least 3, possibly more. They'll be in positions that give them access to sensitive information, servants who clean the council chambers, guards who overhear strategic discussions, merchants who observe supply movements. The paranoia was necessary but exhausting. Everyone was potentially suspect. Every conversation potentially compromised. Every plan potentially known to their enemies before it could be implemented. Can you identify them? Lira hesitated, then shook her head slowly. Magnus was careful to keep his agents compartmentalized. We knew our own missions, but not the details of others' assignments. But I might be able to recognize certain behaviors, certain techniques that would mark them as products of his training program. It was a start, though hardly reassuring given the scope of the infiltration they were facing. Thorne turned back to face her, noting the way exhaustion had settled around her eyes, despite her obvious efforts to remain alert and useful. You should rest, he said gently. Tomorrow we begin preparing for war, and I'll need every advantage you can provide. I can't rest." The words came out more forcefully than she'd probably intended. "Every hour I sleep is another hour for Magnus's people to position themselves for maximum damage. They know I'm here now, know I survived the first assassination attempt. They'll be preparing something more sophisticated, more certain. Then we'll post more guards, increase security measures." "You don't understand." Lira rose from her chair with fluid grace, moving to stand beside him at the window. "I'm not just a target anymore. I'm a weapon that's been turned against its creator. Magnus trained me to think like him, to anticipate his strategies, to understand his methods. That makes me the most dangerous thing in this entire conflict, to both sides." Thorne studied her profile as she gazed out at the peaceful kingdom below, seeing the burden of knowledge she carried and the weight of decisions that had shaped her into something far more complex than simple victim or ally. "Then we'd better make sure you're pointing in the right direction," he said quietly. The ghost of a smile touched her lips. "I've already made that choice, Your Majesty. The question is whether your kingdom can survive the consequences." The moon. Stone pendant lay upon the ancient altar in Shadowmere's deepest vault, its surface seeming to pulse with inner light that had nothing to do with the flickering torches surrounding it. Healer Merrin knelt before the stone table, her weathered hands trembling slightly as she traced the intricate symbols carved into the pendant's silver setting. "I've seen these markings before," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the stone chamber's oppressive silence. "In the oldest texts, the ones that speak of the first pack leaders who united the mountain clans before kingdoms existed." Thorne stood beside her, his own eyes fixed on the pendant that had been hidden beneath Lyra's simple clothing when they'd found her chained to that tree. In the 3 days since the assassination attempt, they'd discovered layer after layer of complexity in her background. Now this ancient artifact suggested depths to her heritage that could change everything about their understanding of pack lore and succession. "What do the symbols mean?" he asked quietly. Merrin's finger traced the largest marking, a wolf's head surrounded by a crescent moon, with smaller symbols radiating outward like rays of light. "This is the mark of the first Alpha, the leader who bound all the mountain packs under a single code of law. The other symbols represent the founding families, the bloodlines that were granted hereditary authority to speak for their people in the great councils. And Lira bears this mark? More than bears it. She embodies it. This pendant doesn't just display the symbols of authority, it reacts to her presence in ways that suggest." Merrin paused, seeming to struggle with the implications of her own observations. "That suggests she carries the bloodline itself." The vault's heavy door swung open with a grinding of ancient hinges, admitting Captain Aldrich and Lira herself. She moved with the fluid alertness that had become her constant state, her green eyes immediately scanning the chamber for threats or escape routes. But when her gaze fell upon the pendant on the altar, she stopped abruptly, as if she'd struck an invisible wall. "Where did you get that?" she asked, her voice carrying a strange mixture of longing and fear. "It was around your neck when we found." "You," Thorne replied, watching her reaction carefully. "Hidden beneath your clothing, close to your heart. You don't remember wearing it." Lira approached the altar slowly, her hands reaching toward the pendant, before stopping just short of contact. "My mother gave it to me when I was very young. She said it had been in our family for generations, that I should never let anyone see it or take it from me. When Magnus began my training, I hid it so thoroughly I sometimes forgot I wore it at all. Your mother never told you what it was. She died before she could explain. A hunting accident when I was 15, the same accident that left me orphaned and vulnerable to Magnus's recruitment." Lyra's voice carried the flat tone of old grief, but her eyes never left the pendant. "I thought it was just a family heirloom, something to remember her by." Healer Merrin gestured for Lira to come closer. "Touch it, child. Let's see what happens." Lira hesitated for several heartbeats, then reached out with careful fingers to brush the pendant's surface. The moment her skin made contact, the chamber filled with soft, silver light that seemed to emanate from the stone itself. The carved symbols glowed with sudden radiance, and the air hummed with energy that made the hair on everyone's arms stand on end. "Blessed ancestors," Merrin breathed, her eyes wide with awe and recognition. "You're not just descended from the first Alpha's line, you're his direct heir, the rightful ruler of all the mountain packs by blood and ancient law." The implications hit the chamber like a physical blow. For generations, the mountain packs had been governed by a complex system of territorial alphas who claimed authority through strength and political maneuvering. But underneath that layer of acquired power lay an older system, one based on hereditary bloodline and the original compact that had created pack civilization in the first place. "That's impossible," Lira whispered, though her fingers remained in contact with the glowing pendant. "I'm nobody. An orphaned Omega who defied her betrothal and nearly died for it. You're the legitimate heir to a throne that predates every kingdom in this region," Thorne said, his mind already working through the political ramifications. "Magnus wasn't just trying to claim you as property. He was trying to eliminate the one person who could challenge his entire power structure." Captain Aldrich stepped forward, his weathered face grave with understanding. "If the other packs learn of this, it changes everything. Pack law recognizes bloodline authority above territorial claims. She could unite them all under legitimate rule instead of Magnus's forced confederation." But Lira was shaking her head, her expression torn between wonder and terror. "You don't understand what you're asking. The first Alpha's bloodline carries more than just political authority. It carries responsibility for every pack member's well-being, obligation to preserve the old ways while adapting to new challenges. It's a burden that destroyed some of my ancestors and drove others to madness." "What do you mean?" Thorne asked, noting the way the pendant's light seemed to pulse in rhythm with Lyra's heartbeat. "The stories my mother told before she died, they weren't just family legends. The first Alpha's descendants were said to carry gifts along with their authority: enhanced senses, deeper connection to pack bonds, the ability to see through deception and feel the emotions of those they led. But the stronger the gifts, the heavier the burden became." She lifted her other hand to join the first, and the pendant's glow intensified until it cast dancing shadows on the vault stone walls. "I thought the training Magnus put me through had made me faster, stronger, more perceptive than normal. But what if those abilities were already there, waiting to be awakened? What if he knew what I was and was trying to corrupt my heritage for his own purposes?" The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with disturbing clarity. Magnus hadn't randomly selected Lira for his assassination program. He'd identified her bloodline and attempted to subvert it to his advantage. When that failed, he'd tried to eliminate her before she could realize her true heritage and claim the authority that was rightfully hers. The betrothal wasn't punishment, Thorne realized aloud. It was a desperate attempt to bind you to him before you discovered what you really were. And the public chaining was meant to break my spirit so completely that I'd never believe myself. "Worthy of challenging him," Lira added, her voice growing stronger as understanding dawned. "He needed me either controlled or dead. Anything else threatened everything he'd built." Healer Merrin had been studying the pendant's glow with professional fascination, noting the way it responded to Lyra's emotional state and seemed to reveal hidden depths within the carved symbols. "There's more here than just proof of heritage. The pendant is reacting to something, responding to power that's been dormant but not destroyed." "What kind of power?" Captain Aldrich asked with the wariness of a soldier who'd learned to be suspicious of anything he couldn't understand or fight. "With conventional weapons, the kind that built pack civilization in the first place," Merrin replied. the kind that bound dozens of feuding clans into a functional society and maintained peace for generations before ambition and corruption began to tear it apart. Lyra's hands were steady on the pendant now, and her green eyes held a growing awareness that seemed to transform her from within. "I can feel them," she said softly. "Not clearly, but like whispers at the edge of hearing. Pack members throughout the mountains, their emotions, their loyalties, their fears. Some call to Magnus out of genuine belief in his vision, others follow him from terror or because they see no alternative. And some," her eyes widened with surprise, "some are already questioning his authority, wondering if there might be a better way." This was the gift that had made the first Alpha legendary, the ability to sense the true feelings of those under his protection, to know when leadership was succeeding or failing based on the emotional health of the community. It was also the gift that had eventually overwhelmed his descendants as the pack network grew too large and complex for any one person to manage. "Can you control it?" Thorne asked with concern. "Focus it on specific groups or individuals?" "I think so. It's getting stronger as I hold the pendant, but it doesn't feel chaotic or overwhelming yet. More like tuning into different conversations in a crowded room. I can choose what to listen to if I concentrate." The strategic implications were staggering. If Lira could sense the true loyalties and motivations of pack members, she would have access to intelligence that no spy network could match. Magnus's agents and allies would be unable to hide their real intentions, and potential supporters could be identified and approached before they even realized their own doubts about the current system. "We need to tell the Council about this," Captain Aldrich said pragmatically. "If we're going to use her heritage as a political weapon, they need to understand what we're working with." But Lira was already shaking her head, her expression troubled by considerations beyond simple tactics. "Not yet. If word of this spreads before I'm ready to claim the authority properly, it could trigger civil war among the packs. Some will rally to the legitimate bloodline, others will see it as a threat to their acquired power, and still others will view it as an opportunity to advance their own ambitions." "Then what do you propose?" Thorne asked, recognizing the wisdom in her. "Gushen, I need time to understand these abilities, to learn how to use them without being overwhelmed by them. And I need to know more about what claiming the first Alpha's authority would actually mean, what obligations it would create, what changes it would require." She lifted the pendant from the altar and fastened its chain around her neck. The silver, light dimming but not disappearing entirely as it settled against her chest. "Most importantly, I need to be certain that I'm strong enough to challenge Magnus not just as a victim seeking justice, but as a legitimate ruler, offering a better alternative to his vision of pack unity." Thorne watched this transformation with a mixture of admiration and concern. The young woman who'd been chained to a tree as punishment for defiance was discovering that she possessed the authority to reshape the entire political structure of the mountain region. But authority without the strength to wield it effectively would only make her a more valuable target for those who preferred the current system. "What can we do to help?" he asked. Lyra's smile held both gratitude and determination. "Help me become worthy of what I've inherited. Help me learn to lead instead of just survive. And when the time comes, help me prove that the old bloodlines still have the power to create something better than what Magnus is building through fear and domination." The pendant's soft glow seemed to pulse with agreement, casting gentle shadows that danced like spirits of the past, offering their blessing to the future their descendant might create. The war horn of unity had not sounded in over 2 centuries. Its deep bronze voice silenced since the last great confederation of mountain clans had dissolved into territorial disputes and forgotten alliances. Now it hung from the highest tower of Shadowmere Keep, its ancient surface polished to gleaming perfection and ready to carry its call across valleys and peaks where decisions of loyalty were being made in countless hearths and council circles. Thorne stood beside the great horn as dawn painted the eastern mountains in shades of gold and crimson, his weathered hands resting on the bronze surface that had summoned armies to both victory and defeat. In the 2 days since Lira's heritage had been revealed, their situation had transformed from desperate defense to something far more complex, a political revolution disguised as a territorial conflict. "The responses are coming in, Captain," Aldrich reported, approaching with a leather satchel filled with messages that had arrived throughout the night. Some by raven, others by fast riders who risked mountain passes in darkness to reach us. Thorne accepted the satchel with steady hands, though his heart raced with the implications of each sealed letter. When they'd sent word of Lira's bloodline to selected contacts among the mountain packs, carefully chosen individuals known for their honor and discontent with Magnus's growing authoritarianism, they'd gambled everything on the hope that legitimate authority might still command respect in a world increasingly governed by fear. "What news?" he asked, breaking the first seal with deliberate calm, mixed but not without hope. "The Silverbrook Pack sends word that they will consider supporting the rightful heir, but they need proof beyond ancient bloodline claims. The Stormwind Pack is already marching, not to us, unfortunately, but to join Magnus's confederation out of fear of being caught between larger forces." Thorne nodded grimly as he scanned the first message, recognizing the careful political language of leaders, trying to balance principle against survival. The Silverbrook Alpha was offering conditional support, valuable if it could be secured, but requiring demonstrations of strength that they might not be able to provide. "Any good news?" he asked, opening the second letter. "The Moonrise Pack has broken with Magnus entirely. Their message is brief but clear. They will stand with the first Alpha's heir against all pretenders." Aldrich's weathered face showed the first smile Thorne had seen from him in days. "That's 300 warriors committed to our cause, and they control the southern approach routes that Magnus would need to move his larger forces." Better news indeed. The Moonrise Pack had suffered under Magnus's expanding influence, forced to provide tribute and young warriors for his ambitions, while receiving little in return. Their defection wasn't just military support, it was proof that the old bloodline still commanded loyalty among those who remembered what pack leadership was supposed to represent. "Where is Lira now?" Thorne asked, noting that the sun was fully above the eastern peaks and the castle was beginning to stir with morning activity. "In the training yards with Master Willem, working on advanced sword techniques. Her progress has been remarkable, almost as if she's remembering skills rather than learning new ones." The awakening of Lira's heritage had brought changes beyond enhanced emotional awareness. Her physical capabilities were expanding daily, reflexes sharpening to levels that surpassed normal human limits. Master Willem, the castle's weapons instructor for over 20 years, had privately admitted to Thorne that she was approaching mastery of combat forms that should take decades to perfect, and her other abilities stronger every day. Yesterday, she identified 2 more of Magnus's agents among the castle staff, sensed their deception before they could act. "We found coded messages in their quarters confirming plans for sabotage during the upcoming battle." Thorne absorbed this information with mixed feelings. Lira's growing powers were invaluable for their defense, but they also marked her transformation from the wounded young woman he'd found chained in the forest into something far more formidable and mysterious. He found himself wondering if the person she was becoming would still need his protection, or if she might soon surpass his ability to provide it. "My lord," came a familiar voice from the tower entrance. Healer Merrin approached with her usual quiet dignity, though Thorne could see concern in her kind eyes. "I need to speak with you about the young woman's condition. Is she unwell?" "Not unwell, exactly, but the rate of change she's experiencing is unprecedented. Her body is adapting to handle abilities that her bloodline carries, but the process is taxing in ways that concern me." Merrin gestured toward the window that overlooked the training yards, where they could see Lira moving through complex sword forms with fluid precision. Even at this distance, there was something otherworldly about her grace and speed, as if she were dancing to music only she could hear. "What kind of taxation?" Thorne asked, his protective instincts engaging despite his recognition that Lira was becoming capable of protecting herself. "Physical exhaustion that sleep doesn't fully cure. Emotional sensitivity that makes her feel the pain and fear of pack members across great distances. And most troubling, she's beginning to show signs of the burden that eventually broke some of her ancestors." The warning sent cold dread through Thorne's chest. What signs? Moments of dissociation when she's overwhelmed by input from her expanding awareness. Brief periods where she seems to forget who and where she is, lost in the emotions and experiences of others. It's not dangerous yet, but if the abilities continue strengthening at this rate, she could lose herself entirely to the collective consciousness of the packs. Thorne finished grimly. It was the dark side of the first Alpha's bloodline. The gift that made effective leadership possible could also consume the individual entirely, leaving behind someone who felt everyone's needs but forgot their own identity. "There are techniques in the old texts for managing such abilities," Merrin continued, "methods the ancient bloodline developed for maintaining individual identity while exercising collective awareness. But they require training and discipline. That takes time we may not have." Below in the courtyard, Lira completed her morning training routine and looked up toward the tower where they stood. Even across the distance, Thorne could see the intensity in her green eyes, an alertness and depth of perception that seemed to pierce through physical barriers and read the emotions of everyone around her. She raised her hand in greeting, and he found himself wondering if she could sense his concerns for her well-being, or if his thoughts were as transparent to her expanding abilities as the motivations of Magnus's agents had become. "We'll make time," he decided. "Whatever she needs to master these gifts safely, we'll provide. The alternative, watching her lose herself to abilities she can't control, is unacceptable." "There's something else," Merrin said quietly. "The techniques for managing such power require not just individual discipline, but external anchoring." The first Alpha maintained his identity through bonds with trusted advisors who could remind him of who he was when the collective awareness threatened to overwhelm his sense of self. The implication was clear, and it sent warmth through Thorne's chest despite the gravity of their situation. Lira would need people she could trust completely, individuals whose emotional stability and unwavering loyalty could serve as fixed points in the chaos of expanded perception. "I understand," he said simply. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of rapid footsteps on the tower stairs. A young page appeared, breathing hard from his climb and clutching a message tube that bore the seal of urgent intelligence. "My lord," the boy gasped, "Captain Aldrich requests your immediate presence in the war room. New intelligence about Magnus's movements. He's accelerating his timeline." Thorne accepted the message tube with steady hands, though his mind was already racing through tactical adjustments. Their 3-day ultimatum had provided barely enough time for initial preparations and reaching out to potential allies. If Magnus was moving faster than expected, they might be forced into battle before Lyra had time to fully master her awakening abilities, or before their political outreach could bear meaningful fruit. "Tell Captain Aldrich I'll be there shortly," he told the page, "and send word to Master Willem. Lady Lyra's training schedule may need to be accelerated as well." As the boy departed, Thorne turned back to Healer Merrin with renewed urgency. How much time does she need to safely integrate these abilities? Under ideal circumstances, weeks, perhaps months. But if forced by immediate necessity, Merrin's expression was grave. She could learn to function with them in days, though the risk of losing herself would be significantly higher. "Then we'd better make sure those days count," Thorne said, moving toward the tower stairs. "And that she has the strongest possible anchors to keep her grounded when the abilities threaten to overwhelm her identity." Behind them, The war horn of unity caught the morning light, its bronze surface gleaming with promise of the call it would soon send across the mountains. In the training yards below, Lira had begun working through combat forms that seemed to flow like water and strike like lightning, her heritage awakening with each passing hour. The old bloodline was stirring to life again, carrying with it both the hope of legitimate leadership and the terrible burden of power that had shaped the mountain packs since their earliest days. Whether that awakening would bring salvation or destruction remained to be seen, but the choice was rapidly approaching, carried on the wind that stirred through ancient peaks and whispered of changes that would reshape everything. In the depths of the northern forest, other preparations were accelerating as well. Magnus paced the war council chamber of his stronghold, his powerful frame radiating fury that had only grown stronger with each passing hour. The defection of allied packs, the identification of his agents within Shadowmere, and most infuriating of all, the rumors beginning to spread about bloodline claims and ancient authority. All of it pointed toward a threat he'd thought he'd eliminated when he ordered Lira chained to that tree. But miscalculations could be corrected, and threats could be destroyed before they grew beyond manageable size. The time for subtle politics and careful maneuvering had passed. Now was the time for overwhelming force and decisive action that would crush this challenge to his vision once and for all. The war that would determine the future of the mountain packs was about to begin, and both sides understood that only one vision of leadership would survive the coming storm. The poisoned chalice sat upon the council table like an accusation carved in silver and malice, its ornate surface reflecting the torchlight in patterns that seemed to writhe and shift with each passing moment. Lord Garrett stared at it with the fascination of a man confronting his own mortality, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled and his cultured voice reduced to hoarse whispers. "How long?" King Thorne asked, his grey eyes never leaving his former advisor's face as Captain Aldrich secured the chamber against interruption. The betrayal was still too fresh, too stunning in its completeness for the full emotional impact to have settled upon him. 15 years, Garrett replied, his confession carrying the weight of accumulated deception that had shaped every major decision of Thorne's reign. "Since shortly after your family's death, when Magnus first approached me with an offer of wealth and position in the new order he was building. 15 years. Thorne felt the number settle into his bones like poison from the chalice that had nearly claimed his life. 15 years of trusted counsel, of shared decisions and private conversations, of secrets revealed to a man who had been reporting everything to his greatest enemy. "The raiders who killed Elena and Marcus," Thorne said, the words coming out, flat and emotionless. That wasn't random violence. Garrett's silence was confirmation enough, but he nodded anyway, unable to meet his king's eyes. "Magnus needed you weakened, consumed by grief and guilt. A broken ruler was easier to manipulate than a strong one. Your family was collateral damage in the larger strategy." The revelation hit Thorne like a physical blow, stealing the breath from his lungs and sending black rage coursing through his veins. For 17 years, he'd carried the guilt of their deaths, believing his absence during peace negotiations had left them vulnerable to random violence. Now to learn that their murder had been calculated, planned, executed as part of a long-term strategy to control him. "My lord," Captain Aldrich said quietly, his weathered hand moving to his sword hilt as he watched the king's expression darken. "With murderous intent. We need him alive for information." The practical reminder cut through Thorne's rage, just enough to prevent him from strangling his former advisor with his bare hands. But the fury remained, cold and sharp as winter steel, promising consequences that would make death seem merciful. "What information?" Thorne asked, his voice carrying deadly calm that made Garrett flinch as if he'd been struck. "Magnus's forces are already moving," Garrett whispered, his cultured composure cracking under the weight of impending retribution. The 3-day ultimatum was never genuine. It was cover for final preparations. By tomorrow night, he'll have over 1,500. Warriors positioned around Shadowmere, not just from allied packs, but mercenaries hired with promises of territory and plunder. The scope of the deception was breathtaking. While Thorne had been preparing for a defensive siege, Magnus had been assembling an overwhelming force designed to crush any resistance before it could organize effectively. The political outreach to potential allies, the careful preparations of defensive positions, the gradual awakening of Lira's abilities, all of it had been compromised from the beginning by intelligence flowing directly to their enemies. What else? Thorne demanded. He knows about her heritage, Garrett said, his voice barely audible. About the pendant and what it represents. That's why he's accelerated the timeline. He can't allow her claim to spread among the packs, or his entire confederation will crumble. The chamber door opened without announcement, admitting Lira with the fluid alertness that had become her constant state. She took one look at the scene, the poisoned chalice, Garrett's defeated posture, the murderous tension radiating from Thorne, and her green eyes blazed with understanding. "I felt your rage from across the castle," she said, her voice carrying the otherworldly awareness that marked her awakening abilities. "And his terror, what did he do?" "Everything," Thorne replied grimly. "Betrayed every confidence, compromised every strategy, orchestrated every loss we've suffered for the past 15 years. Lira's expression shifted as her enhanced perceptions focused on Garrett, reading the emotional resonance of his guilt and fear with devastating accuracy. "He arranged your family's murder," she said flatly. "I can feel the weight of it crushing him, 17 years of carrying that secret while playing the loyal advisor." Garrett's face went white as her abilities stripped away his remaining pretenses. "I never meant for it to go that far," he whispered desperately. "Magnus said he only needed leverage, some way to ensure your cooperation with his long-term plans. I hoped it would just be threats, political pressure. But when threats weren't enough, you didn't try to stop the escalation." Lira interrupted, her voice carrying the implacable judgment of someone who could feel the truth beneath his words. "You let them die because maintaining your position was more important than protecting innocent lives." The condemned man's shoulders sagged with the weight of acknowledged guilt. "I told myself it was necessary for the greater good, that Magnus's vision of unified packs would bring peace to the mountains. But the truth is," his voice broke completely, "the truth is, I was a coward who chose comfort over conscience." Thorne wanted to end Garrett's life in that moment, to satisfy the burning need for vengeance that had been building for 17 years of misdirected guilt. But Lira's presence reminded him of larger responsibilities, of the hundreds of people depending on his leadership in the coming battle. "What are Magnus's specific plans for the attack?" he asked with effort that cost him dearly. "Three-pronged assault, beginning before dawn tomorrow. The main force will approach from the north, drawing your defenders to the primary fortifications. Smaller forces will strike the eastern and western approaches simultaneously, overwhelming your spread defenses. Meanwhile, his remaining agents inside the castle will open the gates and eliminate key leadership targets." The tactical situation was even worse than they'd feared. Magnus wasn't just bringing superior numbers. He was coordinating a complex operation designed to exploit every weakness in Shadowmere's defenses while neutralizing the kingdom's ability to respond effectively. "How many agents remain inside the castle?" Captain Aldrich asked, his mind already working through security implications. "At least 4 that I know of, possibly more that were kept hidden even from me. They have weapons cached throughout the castle and detailed knowledge of your defensive preparations." Lira closed her green eyes for several heartbeats, her consciousness extending outward through the castle's corridors and chambers as she searched for the emotional signatures that marked deception and hostile intent. When she opened them again, her expression was grim. "6," she said with certainty. "I can feel their anticipation and their fear. They know the attack is coming and they're preparing for their roles in it." The revelation that their stronghold was compromised by half a dozen enemy agents was almost as devastating as learning about Garrett's betrayal. Every plan they'd made, every strategy they'd discussed, every preparation they'd undertaken, all of it known to Magnus and factored into his assault calculations. "Can you identify them specifically?" Thorne asked. "Give me time to focus on each signature individually. But my lord, there's something else, something larger moving in the darkness beyond the castle walls." Lira's awareness expanded again, reaching outward across the mountain valleys where Magnus's forces were positioning themselves for the coming attack. Her face went pale as the scope of what she perceived settled into her consciousness. "It's not 1,500 warriors," she whispered. "It's closer to 2,000. And they're not just positioning for siege, they're preparing for complete destruction. Magnus doesn't plan to leave anything standing that might serve as a symbol of resistance to his authority." The final piece of Magnus's strategy became clear. With horrifying simplicity, this wasn't about reclaiming escaped property or even eliminating a political rival. It was about demonstrating to every pack in the mountains that defying his will would result in total annihilation, not just of individuals, but of entire communities that dared to shelter those who opposed him. "Then we can't win through traditional defense," Thorne said, his tactical mind engaging with the impossible odds they faced. "We need a different approach entirely. We need to turn his trap against him," Lira agreed, her voice gaining strength as her heritage asserted itself. "Use his confidence in the intelligence he's been receiving to create opportunities for counterattack, Captain." Aldrich looked between them with the expression of a soldier who'd followed orders into hopeless battles before and emerged victorious through audacity and desperate courage. "What did you have in mind?" Thorne moved to the chamber's window, gazing out at his kingdom's peaceful evening routine, while his mind worked through possibilities that balanced desperate necessity against slim chances of success. Tomorrow would bring overwhelming force, directed against everything he'd built and everyone he'd sworn to protect. Traditional defensive strategies would only delay the inevitable. But if Magnus was expecting to face a broken, demoralized enemy, led by a king who'd been manipulated for 15 years, if he was counting on intelligence from agents who thought their cover remained intact, then perhaps there was room for the kind of surprise that could shift the balance of an apparently hopeless conflict. "We're going to do something Magnus won't expect," Thorne decided, turning back to face the others with renewed determination. "We're going to trust each other completely, move faster than his intelligence network can track, and turn his own agents into sources of misinformation that serve our purposes instead of his." Lira's smile held both fierce satisfaction and something deeper, the awakening recognition of power that had been sleeping too long but was finally stirring to defend what mattered most. "Then let's give him a war he'll never forget," she said, her voice carrying echoes of authority that had once united the mountain packs under leadership worthy of their loyalty. The betrayal was complete, the enemy's advantage overwhelming, and the odds of survival vanishingly small. But in that moment, as they prepared to face impossible challenges with nothing but trust in each other and determination to protect what they valued most, Thorne felt something he hadn't experienced since his family's death, the fierce joy of fighting for a cause worth any sacrifice. Tomorrow would bring war. Tonight they would prepare to achieve the impossible. The Alpha's crown rested upon a cushion of midnight blue velvet in Shadowmere's most sacred chamber, its ancient gold gleaming with inner fire that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the mountain's heartbeat. Carved with symbols that predated written language and set with stones that caught starlight even in windowless rooms, it was far more than mere ceremonial headpiece. It was the physical embodiment of authority that had once united countless feuding clans under leadership worthy of their trust. Lira knelt before the crown as dawn approached, her green eyes reflecting its otherworldly radiance, while Healer Merrin spoke the words of coronation that hadn't been heard in the mountains for over 3 centuries. The ceremony should have taken place in daylight before assembled multitudes, but war was coming with the sunrise, and they had only stolen moments for the ritual that would legitimize everything they were about to attempt. By blood and birthright, by ancient law and sacred trust, Merrin intoned, her voice carrying the weight of traditions that connected them to the very foundations of Pack civilization. I crown you Lira, first alpha of the united Packs, rightful heir to the authority that shaped these lands when the world was young. The crown settled onto Lira's dark hair with surprising lightness, as if it had been waiting centuries for this moment of return to its proper wearer. The moment the ancient gold touched her brow, change rippled through the chamber like water. Disturbed by falling stones, the air itself seemed to thicken with power, and every person present felt the weight of witnessing something that would reshape the political landscape of their world. Thorne watched this transformation with emotions too complex for simple categorization. Pride in her courage and dignity, concern for the burden she was accepting, wonder at the beauty of seeing ancient justice finally restored, and underneath it all, a growing awareness that the young woman he'd found chained to a tree was becoming something far greater than either of them had imagined possible. "How does it feel?" he asked quietly, as Merrin completed the ritual words, and stepped back with tears of joy streaming down her weathered cheeks. "Like coming home," Lira replied, rising to her feet with fluid grace that seemed enhanced by the crown's presence. "Like remembering who I was, always meant to be, even when I couldn't understand why I felt so lost and incomplete." But even as she spoke, Thorne could see the changes taking place beyond simple confidence or restored identity. Her awareness was expanding again, reaching out across the mountains with enhanced clarity that made her previous abilities seem like whispers compared to the clear voice of authority she now commanded. "Magnus's forces are in position," she said, her consciousness touching the minds of warriors gathered in darkness throughout the valleys around Shadowmere. "But something's changed since yesterday. Some of his allied packs are having second thoughts, now that word of the true bloodline is spreading." This was exactly what they'd hoped for when they'd sent carefully crafted messages to selected packs, leaders during the night, not demands for immediate support, but simple notifications that the first Alpha's heir had been found and would soon claim her rightful authority. The political implications of that revelation were still rippling outward, through the complex network of alliances and obligations that governed mountain politics. "How many are wavering?" Captain Aldrich asked, his tactical mind immediately engaging with the strategic possibilities. "Perhaps 200 warriors from 3 different packs. They came to support Magnus's confederation, but now they're questioning whether they're on the right side of this conflict." Lyra's voice carried the otherworldly certainty that marked her expanded perceptions. "Their alphas are trying to maintain discipline, but doubt is spreading through the ranks like wildfire." "Can you influence that doubt?" Thorne asked, recognizing the potential for turning enemy forces against each other without bloodshed. "Not directly. That would be manipulation rather than leadership. But I can project the emotional resonance of legitimate authority. Let them feel the difference between following orders out of fear and choosing loyalty based on recognized right to rule." The distinction mattered more than tactical considerations. The kind of leadership Lira represented was fundamentally different from Magnus's approach, based on consent and earned respect rather than domination and intimidation. If she used her abilities to coerce rather than inspire, she would become just another version of what they were fighting against. A soft knock at the chamber door interrupted their discussion, admitting one of the castle's most trusted messengers, with news that sent tension spiking through the room. "My lord," the young woman said breathlessly, "Captain Aldrich's agents report movement in the eastern valleys. Magnus isn't waiting for full dawn. His attack begins within the hour." The timeline they'd calculated based on Garrett's intelligence had been compressed even further. Magnus was moving with desperate speed, trying to crush any organized resistance before Lyra's coronation could inspire widespread defection from his confederation. "Then we proceed with the plan," Thorne decided, moving toward the chamber's weapon rack where his battle gear waited. "Signal phases 1 and 2 simultaneously. We don't have time for gradual implementation." The plan they developed during the sleepless night was audacious to the point of madness, requiring perfect coordination between elements that had never worked together before. But traditional defensive strategies would only delay inevitable defeat, and their only hope lay in doing something so unexpected that Magnus's superior numbers became a liability rather than an advantage. "Are you ready for this?" Thorne asked Lira as she secured the crown with silver pins that would hold it in place during combat. "I've been preparing for this my entire life without knowing it," she replied, her voice carrying confidence that seemed to flow from the ancient authority she now embodied. "Every lesson Magnus taught me about warfare and deception, every technique I learned during his training, all of it was preparation for this moment when I'd use those skills to tear down everything he's built." Outside the sacred chamber, Shadowmere, it was transforming from sleeping fortress into active battleground. Warriors moved through corridors with quiet efficiency, taking positions that had been planned and rehearsed during the long night. But these weren't the purely defensive preparations Magnus's intelligence network expected. They were elements of a counterattack designed to turn the castle itself into a weapon against the forces surrounding it. In the Great Hall, the remaining members of the Royal Council were making final preparations for their own roles in the coming battle. Lady Morven supervised the distribution of weapons to servants and staff members who'd volunteered to defend their home. Lord Harwick coordinated with the kingdom's militia leaders, ensuring that every available fighter understood their part in the desperate gamble they were about to attempt. And in the castle's deepest dungeons, the 6 enemy agents Lira had identified were being fed carefully crafted misinformation about Shadowmere's defensive capabilities and strategic plans. They believed they were observing final preparations for a traditional siege defense, unaware that their reports to Magnus would actually serve to make his forces more vulnerable to the surprise they wouldn't see coming. "The war horn," Lira said. Suddenly, her expanded awareness touching something that made her green eyes blaze with fierce satisfaction. "It's time," Thorne nodded, understanding immediately what she meant. The ancient horn that had remained silent for 2 centuries was about to sound again, but not as a call for help or desperate rallying cry. This time, it would announce the return of legitimate authority to the mountains and challenge every warrior within hearing to choose between the old ways of domination and a new path toward genuine unity. They climbed the tower stairs together, king and newly crowned Alpha, their footsteps echoing with the weight of decisions that would reshape their world. Behind them, the sacred chamber held only empty velvet cushions and the lingering resonance of power that had been dormant too long, but was finally stirring to active purpose. At the tower's peak, the great bronze horn waited in the pre-dawn darkness, its ancient surface reflecting the first pale hints of sunrise on the eastern horizon. Thorne placed his hands on the worn bronze, feeling the metal warm beneath his touch, as if responding to the significance of this moment. "Together," he asked, looking at Lira, whose crown caught the early light and transformed it into something that seemed to burn with inner fire. "Together," she agreed, placing her own hands beside his on the horn's ancient surface. The sound that emerged when they blew the war horn of unity was unlike anything that had been heard in the mountains for centuries. Deep and resonant, carrying across valleys and peaks with authority that seemed to shake the very foundations of the world. But underneath its bronze voice was something else, a harmonic resonance that spoke directly to the hearts of those who heard it, calling them to remember what leadership was supposed to represent and what unity was supposed to achieve. In the darkness surrounding Shadowmere, Magnus's forces heard that call and felt its power touch something deep within their souls. Some responded with renewed determination to crush this challenge to their master's authority. Others felt doubt bloom into open question about whether they were serving the right cause. But in the castle itself, the horn's call was answered by voices raised in defiance and weapons lifted in readiness. The impossible was about to be attempted, and everyone involved understood that they were fighting not just for their own survival, but for the soul of their civilization. War was coming, with the sunrise. But for the first time since this conflict began, they faced it not as victims hoping to survive, but as rightful defenders of something worth protecting with their lives. The crown blazed on Lira's brow as she prepared to lead her first battle. As alpha of the United Packs, the ancient bloodline was fully awakened now, carrying with it both the gifts and the terrible responsibilities that had shaped the mountains since civilization first took root in the high places of the world. What followed would determine whether that legacy would die in darkness or be reborn. In the light of a new dawn, built on justice rather than fear, the shield of the innocent manifested as the first arrows fell like deadly rain across Shadowmere's battlements, appearing as a shimmering barrier of silver light that turned aside steel points and protected the defenders who fought for justice rather than conquest. Lira stood upon the castle's highest tower, her crown blazing with inner fire as she channeled the ancient power that had once protected entire civilizations from those who would destroy them. Magnus comes from the north with his main force. She called down to King Thorne, her voice carrying clearly despite the chaos of battle beginning to unfold around them. 800 warriors in disciplined formation, expecting to face traditional defensive positions, but Shadowmere's defenses were anything but traditional. The knights' desperate preparations had transformed the castle from fortress into elaborate trap, with concealed positions and surprise weapons that would turn Magnus's superior numbers into a liability. Captain Aldrich's warriors waited in shadows, and hidden chambers ready to strike at exposed flanks rather than meet overwhelming force head-on. Thorne drew his ancient blade, its steel singing as it cleared the scabbard that had held it through 3 decades of battles. "Signal the eastern and western teams," he commanded. "Let Magnus think his 3-pronged attack is proceeding as planned." The deception was crucial to their desperate strategy. Magnus's forces were expecting to face a broken, demoralized enemy, led by a king who'd been manipulated for 15 years. Instead, they would encounter coordinated resistance, guided by intelligence they couldn't match and protected by power they didn't understand. "The shield is holding," Lira reported, her expanded awareness monitoring the protective barrier that deflected enemy projectiles while allowing friendly forces to strike back. "But I can feel Magnus's rage building. He knows something has changed, even if he doesn't understand what." Below them, the first wave of Magnus's assault crashed against Shadowmere's outer defenses like a tide of steel and fury. Warriors bearing the emblems of half a dozen allied packs surged toward the castle walls, their war cries echoing across the mountain valleys. But instead of finding the desperate resistance they expected, they encountered something that made veteran fighters pause in confusion and growing unease. The defenders they faced moved with coordination that spoke of shared purpose rather than desperate survival. Their tactics were aggressive rather than defensive, striking at weak points rather than simply holding ground, and overhead the impossible sight of arrows and spear points turning aside as if deflected by invisible barriers challenged everything they thought they knew about the nature of this conflict. "Something's wrong," came Magnus's voice, carrying clearly across the battlefield as he drove his forces toward what should have been an easy victory. "They're fighting like they know something we don't." That knowledge was the bond between legitimate authority and those who chose to follow it, a connection that made individual fighters part of something larger and more powerful than the sum of their separate abilities. Magnus's confederation was held together by fear and obligation, but Lyra's defenders were united by shared belief in what they were protecting. "The eastern approach," Lira said suddenly, her awareness shifting to the secondary battlefield where another part of Magnus's plan was unfolding. "They're meeting heavier resistance than expected. Some of the Ironbark warriors are breaking away from the attack. They can sense the shield's power, and they're beginning to question their orders." This was exactly what they'd hoped for, but hardly dared to expect. The legitimacy of Lyra's claim was manifesting not just as political theory, but as tangible power that resonated with something deep in pack consciousness. Warriors who'd come to fight for Magnus's vision of unity through domination were encountering unity through willing cooperation, and the contrast was impossible to ignore. "Can you extend the shield to cover their retreat?" Thorne asked, recognizing the strategic opportunity. "Already doing it," Lira replied, her consciousness reaching out to embrace the warriors who were abandoning Magnus's cause. "They're not enemies anymore. They're potential allies who need protection while they choose their true loyalty." The silver barrier expanded, its protective glow extending beyond Shadowmere's walls to shelter those who were breaking away from Magnus's forces. The sight of enemy warriors being protected by the same power that shielded the castle's defenders sent shockwaves through both armies, demonstrating more clearly than any proclamation the difference between leadership based on fear and authority based on earned trust. "Magnus is adapting," Captain Aldrich reported, his weathered voice carrying up from the courtyard where he coordinated the castle's mobile defense units. "He's pulling back from direct assault and trying to surround us completely. Wants to starve us out rather than break himself against defenses he doesn't understand." But siege tactics required time that Magnus might not have. Every hour that passed allowed word of Lyra's coronation and the shield's manifestation to spread throughout the mountain communities. Political alliances that had seemed solid were beginning to crack under the pressure of choosing between established power and legitimate authority. "The Silverbrook Pack," Lira announced, her awareness touching minds across great distances. "They're marching to join us, 300 warriors who've decided that blood right matters more than political convenience." More good news, but it would be hours before those reinforcements could reach them. In the meantime, they had to survive Magnus's attempts to crush this challenge before it could grow beyond his ability to contain. Western approach under heavy pressure, came another report from the battlefield. "They're bringing up siege engines, catapults, and battering rams designed to breach the outer walls." Thorne moved to the tower's western window, seeing the massive wooden constructs being wheeled into position by work crews that had clearly been prepared for exactly this type of assault. Magnus's planning had been thorough, accounting for the possibility that Shadowmere might prove more difficult to capture than initially expected. "The shield can deflect projectiles," Lira said, understanding his concern, "but it can't stop sustained structural damage from siege weapons. We need a different approach." The solution came from an unexpected source. Healer Merrin's voice rose from the courtyard below, carrying the authority of someone whose wisdom had guided the kingdom through countless crises. "The old texts speak of offensive applications for the shield, turning protection into weapon when those under its care are threatened with destruction." Lyra's green eyes blazed with sudden understanding. Not just defense, but active protection through elimination of threats. The shield doesn't just deflect attacks, it can redirect them back toward their source. The tactical implications were staggering. Instead of passively enduring Magnus's siege weapons, they could turn those same weapons against his forces. Catapult stones could be caught and returned with devastating precision. Battering rams could be stopped, and their momentum reversed to crush the crews operating them. "Show them what it means to threaten the innocent," Thorne said grimly, his own battle instincts engaging with the possibilities. Lira raised her hands toward the approaching siege engines, her consciousness focusing the shield's power into something more active and directional. The silver barrier shimmered and reformed, becoming not just protective wall, but reflective. surface that gathered incoming force and prepared to return it with interest. The first catapult stone launched toward Shadowmere's western wall never reached its target. Instead, it struck the shield's surface and rebounded with twice its original velocity, smashing through the siege engine that had launched it and continuing on to devastate the crew positions behind it. The effect on Magnus's forces was immediate and profound. Warriors who'd been advancing with confidence suddenly found themselves scrambling for cover as their own weapons turned against them. The psychological impact was even greater than the tactical advantage. They were facing something that challenged their fundamental understanding of how battles were supposed to work. "This isn't natural," came voices from the enemy ranks. "This isn't fair combat. This is sorcery and ancient magic." But it wasn't sorcery. It was the manifestation of legitimacy, the physical expression of authority that had been earned rather than seized. The power that protected Lira's defenders was the same force that had once united the mountain packs under leadership worthy of their trust. It was ancient, but it was also fundamentally right in ways that resonated with something deeper than tactical considerations. "Magnus is pulling back again," Captain Aldrich reported with grim satisfaction. "His forces are taking heavy casualties without inflicting significant damage on our defenses. But he's not retreating. He's regrouping for something different." That something became clear as enemy forces began spreading out in a wide circle around the castle, taking positions that suggested a prolonged siege rather than direct assault. Magnus was adapting his strategy again, recognizing that overwhelming force wasn't going to achieve quick victory against defenders protected by power he couldn't match or counter. "He's going to try to outlast us," Thorne realized. "Cut off our supply lines and wait for the shield to weaken as Lira's strength fails." But Lira's smile held fierce confidence that suggested Magnus's new strategy was built on assumptions that were no longer valid. "Let him try. The shield doesn't draw its power from me alone. It draws from every person who chooses to stand with legitimate authority against those who would rule through fear." As if summoned by her words, voices rose from the castle's defenders. Not cries of desperation or fear, but songs of defiance and determination that spoke of shared purpose and unbreakable will. The shield pulsed brighter with each voice added to the chorus, drawing strength from the community it protected and growing more powerful as that community demonstrated its unity. This was the true test of leadership, not the ability to command through fear or manipulation, but the capacity to inspire others to willingly contribute their strength to a cause larger than themselves. Magnus's confederation was held together by obligation and intimidation, but Lira's alliance was forged from choice and shared belief in something worth protecting. The battle was far from over, but its essential character was becoming clear. This wasn't just a military conflict, it was a contest between two completely different visions of what leadership should represent and how communities should function. The outcome would determine not just who ruled the mountain packs, but what kind of civilization would emerge from the chaos of this confrontation. Dawn was breaking across the peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to echo the fire burning in Lira's crown. The shield blazed with silver radiance that promised protection to those who stood for justice, and justice for those who had been denied protection too long. The war for the soul of the mountains had begun in earnest. The sword of unity materialized in Lira's hands like crystallized starlight given form and purpose, its blade catching the morning sun and reflecting it as pure radiance that made every warrior on the battlefield pause in wonder. This was the weapon of legend, appearing only when the rightful leader arose to defend what mattered most against those who would destroy it for personal gain. Magnus stood in the center of his remaining forces, his powerful frame radiating fury, as he watched his carefully constructed confederation crumble around him. Half his allied packs had withdrawn from the battle. their warriors unwilling to continue fighting against power they recognized as legitimate. His siege weapons lay in ruins, turned against his own forces by defenses he couldn't overcome or understand. "This ends now," he roared, his voice carrying across the battlefield with the authority he'd built through years of intimidation and calculated violence. "Single combat, alpha against alpha, winner takes all." The challenge rang through the mountain air with the weight of ancient tradition, invoking laws older than kingdoms or formal governments. In the deepest roots of pack culture, leadership disputes could be settled through personal combat between those who claimed authority, with the outcome determining not just individual fate, but the loyalty of entire communities. Thorne started forward, his own blade ready to answer Magnus's challenge, but Lira's gentle hand on his arm stopped him. "This is my burden to carry," she said quietly, her green eyes steady despite the magnitude of what she was accepting. "I am the first Alpha's heir. The challenge is rightfully mine." "You don't have to face him alone," Thorne protested, his protective instincts warring with recognition of her authority and right to choose her own battles. "I won't be alone," Lira replied, her gaze moving to encompass all the defenders who had chosen to stand with her cause. "Everyone who believes in something better than rule through fear. They're all with me in this moment." She descended from the castle walls with the fluid grace that marked her awakened heritage, the sword of unity blazing in her hands as she approached the circle that tradition demanded for such challenges. Warriors from both sides formed the boundaries of combat, their faces reflecting mixtures of anticipation, fear, and awe at witnessing a confrontation that would reshape their world. Magnus drew his own weapon, a massive blade forged for strength and intimidation rather than elegance. Where Lira's sword seemed to sing with inner light, his was dark steel designed to crush rather than inspire. The contrast between the weapons reflected the fundamental difference in their approaches to leadership and power. "You should have stayed chained to that tree," Magnus snarled as they began circling each other within the combat ring. "Should have accepted your proper place instead of poisoning minds with impossible dreams of something better. The only poison here is the fear you've used to control people who deserved better leadership," Lira replied, her voice carrying the certainty that came from knowing she fought for something larger than personal ambition. Magnus struck first, his blade descending in a brutal arc designed to overwhelm her smaller frame through sheer force. But the sword of unity moved to meet his attack with speed that seemed to bend the very air around it, deflecting his strike and responding with a counter that forced him back several steps. The watching warriors gasped as they realized this wouldn't be the quick, brutal execution Magnus had clearly expected. Lira's training under his own program, combined with her awakened heritage and the legendary weapon she wielded, made her a match for his strength and experience. "Impossible," Magnus breathed, his confidence shaken by her competence. "I trained. You myself, I know your limitations. You trained the person I used to be," Lira corrected, pressing her advantage with a series of attacks that forced him to give ground. "You never understood the person I was becoming." Their blades met and locked, bringing them face to face as each struggled for advantage. In that moment of contact, the corrupt council members who had supported Magnus throughout his rise to power suddenly revealed themselves among the watching crowd, drawing concealed weapons and preparing to strike at Lira's exposed back. But Captain Aldrich and his warriors had been watching for exactly such treachery. Steel rang against steel as loyal defenders intercepted the assassination attempt, their own blades making short work of enemies who had relied too long on surprise and deception rather than honest combat skills. "Even in single combat, you resort to cheating and betrayal," Thorne called out, his voice carrying the disgust of a man who'd spent his life trying to uphold honor even in the darkest circumstances. Magnus's face twisted with rage at seeing his final gambit fail. Honor is a luxury for those strong enough to afford it, he snarled, breaking the blade lock and launching himself at Lira with desperate fury that abandoned all pretense of skill in favor of brutal determination to destroy what he couldn't control. But desperation made him reckless, and recklessness created opportunities for someone with the training and instincts he'd helped to develop. Lira sidestepped his wild charge, her blade singing through the air to open a long cut across his sword arm that weakened his grip and sent droplets of blood spattering across the combat circle. "Yield," she commanded. The sword of Unity's point, resting at his throat as he stumbled and nearly fell. "Acknowledge the authority you've spent years trying to corrupt, and perhaps your life can be spared." For a moment, it seemed as though reason might prevail over pride. Magnus's eyes showed recognition of his defeat, understanding that continued resistance would only lead to death without accomplishing anything meaningful. The warrior code demanded acceptance of legitimate victory, even when that victory came at great personal cost. But years of building power through fear and intimidation had rotted something essential in Magnus's character. Rather than accept honorable defeat, he chose desperate treachery as his final act. The concealed dagger appeared in his offhand with the speed of long practice, aimed not at Lira, but at the watching crowd where Thorne stood among the defenders. If he couldn't eliminate the rightful heir, perhaps he could still strike at those who supported her and create enough chaos to escape. The blade flew through the air with lethal accuracy, its trajectory aimed at Thorne's heart. But Lyra's enhanced awareness had sensed the attack before it was fully formed, and her response came with the speed of inherited gifts operating at their full potential. The sword of Unity blazed with sudden radiance as she spun to intercept. The thrown weapon, her blade meeting the dagger in mid-flight and shattering it into harmless fragments. But the effort required to save Thorne's life left her momentarily exposed, and Magnus seized what he thought would be his final opportunity. He lunged forward with his wounded arm, still managing to wield his great sword, putting all his remaining strength into a strike aimed at ending this challenge permanently. But instead of finding vulnerable flesh, his blade met something that shouldn't have been possible, a barrier of silver light that erupted from Lyra's position and expanded outward with force that sent him flying backward across the combat circle. The shield of the innocent had manifested around her in response to Magnus's final act of treachery, recognizing that he represented a threat not just to Lira personally, but to everyone who sought a better way of living together. The ancient power that protected the rightful leader was also the power that eliminated those who would destroy legitimate authority for personal gain. Magnus struck the ground hard and lay motionless, his great sword shattered and his body broken, by forces he'd never understood or respected. The silence that followed was profound, filled with the recognition that an era had ended and something new was beginning to take its place. "It's finished," Lira said quietly, the sword of Unity dimming. To normal steel as the immediate threat passed. Around the combat circle, warriors from Magnus's remaining forces were laying down their weapons, their loyalty transferring to the victor as ancient law demanded. But even as triumph settled over the battlefield, Lyra's enhanced awareness was picking up something that made her blood run cold. In his final moments of consciousness, Magnus had triggered something, a signal or prearranged contingency that was setting larger forces in motion. "This battle is won," she announced, her voice carrying to every warrior present. But the war isn't over. Magnus had allies beyond these mountains, powers that won't accept his defeat or the restoration of legitimate authority. Thorne approached the center of the combat circle, his own blade still ready despite the apparent victory. "What kind of allies?" "The kind that prefer chaos and division to unity and strength," Lira replied, her awareness extending beyond the immediate battlefield to touch minds and intentions across much greater distances. Magnus wasn't building his confederation just for personal power. He was serving something darker, something that benefits when legitimate authority is destroyed and replaced with rule through fear. The full scope of what they'd been fighting became clear in that moment. Magnus hadn't just been an ambitious alpha seeking to expand his territory. He'd been a tool of forces that wanted to prevent any restoration of the unity and strength that had once made the mountain packs a significant power in their region. "Then we'd better prepare for what comes next," Thorne said grimly, understanding that their victory had likely made them targets for enemies they hadn't even known existed. But as Lira looked around at the warriors who had chosen to stand with legitimate authority against corruption and fear, she felt confidence that hadn't been there before. The sword of unity still hummed with power in her hands, and the shield of the innocent remained ready to protect those who fought for something better than the law of the strongest. "Let them come," she said, her voice carrying the authority of bloodline that had defended these mountains for generations beyond counting. "We'll be ready." The immediate battle was over, but the larger war for the soul of their civilization was just beginning. And for the first time since this conflict started, they faced that prospect not as desperate survivors, but as rightful defenders of something worth any sacrifice to preserve. The Unity banner unfurled in the mountain wind 6 months after the battle that had changed everything, its fabric combining the symbols of every pack that had chosen legitimate authority over rule through fear. Woven in threads of silver and gold, the banner displayed the wolf's head of the first alpha, surrounded by smaller emblems, representing communities that had found their voice again after years of intimidation and silence. Lira stood on the balcony of what had once been Magnus's stronghold, now transformed into the seat of the United Pack Council, where representatives from across the mountains gathered to shape their shared future. The Alpha's crown rested easily on her dark hair, no longer feeling like a burden, but like a natural extension of the authority she'd grown into through months of patient work, rebuilding what had been broken. "The Southern Territories have agreed to the new trade agreements," Thorne reported, joining her on the balcony with documents that represented another step toward the prosperity and cooperation their vision had promised. Even packs that initially resisted are beginning to see the benefits of unity based on mutual respect rather than domination. The transformation hadn't been easy or immediate. Defeating Magnus in single combat had established Lyra's right to rule, but earning the trust and cooperation of communities that had learned to survive through suspicion and isolation required different skills entirely. Months of patient diplomacy, of proving through actions rather than words that leadership could serve rather than exploit, had slowly built the foundation for something unprecedented in the mountain territories. "Any word from the eastern valleys?" Lira asked, her enhanced awareness still monitoring the emotional currents that flowed through the pack network she now led. The abilities that had nearly overwhelmed her during those first desperate days had stabilized into tools she could use, without losing herself in the collective consciousness of her people. 3 more packs have requested formal incorporation into the Confederation. They've seen how the trade routes and mutual defense agreements have benefited the early adopters, and they want the security and prosperity that comes with legitimate membership. It was gratifying progress, but Lyra's expression remained thoughtful as she considered the larger challenges they still faced. Magnus's defeat had eliminated one source of corruption and fear, but it had also revealed the existence of forces beyond the mountains that preferred chaos and division to the kind of strength that came from genuine unity. Captain Aldrich's intelligence network has identified at least 3 separate attempts to destabilize the Confederation through infiltration and sabotage, she said, her voice carrying the weight of responsibilities that had grown far beyond what either of them had imagined when he'd first found her chained to that tree. "There are powers outside our territories that view our success as a threat to their own interests." Thorne nodded grimly, understanding the implications of their expanding influence. a confederation of mountain packs united under legitimate authority, and cooperating for mutual benefit was something entirely new in their region's political landscape. Such innovation inevitably attracted attention from established powers who preferred the status quo of division and weakness among potential rivals. "But we're not the same people who barely survived Magnus's assault," he pointed out, his grey eyes reflecting pride in how much they'd all grown through the challenges of the past months. "We have allies now, resources, and most importantly, we have something worth defending." That was the crucial difference between what they'd built and what Magnus had attempted to create. His confederation had been held together by fear and obligation, requiring constant application of force to maintain loyalty. Lira's united packs were bound by shared benefit and mutual respect, growing stronger as each community discovered how much they could accomplish when they worked together, rather than competing for scarce resources. "The coronation ceremony is ready," Gila Merrin announced, approaching with the quiet dignity that had made her invaluable during the months of rebuilding. Representatives from every member pack are assembled in the Great Hall, along with delegations from 3 neighboring kingdoms who want to establish formal diplomatic relations. The ceremony would mark the official establishment of the United Pacts as a recognized political entity, with Lira acknowledged not just as first alpha by blood right, but as elected leader by the consent of those she served. It was a moment they'd been working towards since the morning she'd first accepted the crown in Shadowmere's sacred chamber. "How do you feel?" Thorne asked quietly, as they prepared to descend to the great hall where history was waiting to be made. "Like I'm finally becoming who I was always meant to be," Lira replied, her green eyes steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "Not the weapon Magnus tried to forge, not the victim his council tried to break, but the leader my heritage prepared me to become." The great hall had been transformed for the occasion, its walls hung with banners representing every community that had chosen to join the Confederation. Warriors who had once faced each other in battle now stood side by side as honor guards, their presence demonstrating that former enemies could become trusted allies when leadership proved worthy of that trust. As Lira entered the hall, the assembled representatives rose in respect that had been earned rather than demanded. These were people who had chosen to follow her not from fear or obligation, but because she'd proven that authority could serve rather than exploit, that strength could protect rather than oppress. "Today, we celebrate not just the coronation of a leader," Thorne announced, as he took his place beside the throne that had been crafted to accommodate both tradition and the needs of a new kind of government, but the birth of a new way of living together in these mountains. The ceremony that followed honored the ancient traditions that gave legitimacy to Lira's bloodline, while incorporating innovations that reflected the Confederation's commitment to cooperation and mutual respect. When the final words were spoken, and the crown was formally placed upon her head by representatives of the member packs rather than by a single authority figure, the great hall erupted in celebration that came from genuine joy rather than enforced compliance. But even as they celebrated this achievement, both Lira and Thorne understood that it was a beginning rather than an ending. The unity banner that flew above the stronghold represented not just what they'd accomplished, but what they'd committed to defending against all those who would prefer a return to the old ways of division and fear. "You know this will make us your targets for every power that benefits from chaos and weakness," Thorne said quietly, as they stood together on the throne room's balcony, watching the sun set over mountains that were finally at peace with themselves. "Then they'll learn what Magnus learned," Lira replied, her voice carrying the quiet confidence that had replaced the uncertainty and pain he'd first seen in her eyes. "That some things are worth any sacrifice to protect, and that legitimate authority has power that corruption and fear can never match." The sword of unity and shield of the innocent were no longer visible, their immediate purpose fulfilled, but the power they represented remained. It lived in the bonds of trust between communities that had chosen cooperation over competition, in the trade routes that carried prosperity to previously isolated settlements, in the schools where children learned that strength could serve justice, rather than personal ambition. As night fell across the mountains, lights appeared in windows throughout the valleys, not the fearful glimmers of people hiding from those who would prey upon them, but the warm glow of communities that knew they were part of something larger and stronger than any individual threat they might face. The transformation from the wounded young woman chained to a tree to the leader of a new kind of civilization was complete. But more than personal growth had been achieved. An entire region had been shown that there was an alternative to the law of the strongest, that unity based on consent was more powerful than domination based on fear. The unity banner stirred. In the evening breeze, its symbols catching starlight and transforming it into something that seemed to shine with inner radiance. Below in the great hall, music and laughter continued late into the night, as people who had once lived in isolation celebrated their discovery of what they could accomplish together. And in the quiet moments between public duties and ceremonial obligations, Lira and Thorne found the personal happiness that had seemed impossible during those desperate days when survival itself was uncertain. The bond that had begun with his decision to protect someone who had no one else had grown into partnership that encompassed both governance and the deeper connections that made leadership meaningful rather than merely functional. The old ways had passed away, defeated not by force alone, but by the demonstration of something better. In their place, a new civilization was taking root in the high places of the world, one that would face whatever challenges the future might bring with the strength that came from people who had chosen to stand together rather than being forced to submit to others' will. The unity banner continued to fly as the seasons changed and years passed, its message spreading beyond the mountains to inspire others who had grown weary of rule through fear and domination. What had begun as one king's decision to protect an innocent young woman had become a beacon of hope for all those who believed that legitimate authority should serve rather than exploit, that strength should protect rather than oppress, and that unity based on mutual respect was more powerful than any confederation built on intimidation and fear. The crown that had once seemed impossibly heavy now rested easily on Lira's head, not as a burden to be endured, but as a symbol of the trust placed in her by people who had discovered what they could accomplish when they worked together toward shared goals. And in the evening light that painted the mountains gold and crimson, the future stretched ahead, filled with possibilities that none of them had dared to imagine during those dark days when the old ways seemed destined to triumph over hope itself.